Setting up a game. Building an army. The Ninth Age, Fantasy Battles includes a series of army books which contain the unique rules for characters and troops and the descriptions of the different armies. All unit entries within an army book are divided into different army categories, which may be limited to represent a minimum or maximum percentage of the army points. The first step in building an army is writing down a selection of units, options, and their point costs on a document called the army list. An army is subject to certain rules and restrictions, which this chapter will describe in further detail. Point costs. Every unit, weapon, upgrade, special item, etc. costs a certain amount of points. The Ninth Age uses point costs to balance units and options so two players can enjoy a game that tests their skills. This allows for quick pickup games between friends or helps design scenarios where you need to know how powerful certain things are. A unit's point cost is the total of its starting point cost and the point costs of all its upgrades. An army's point cost is the total of all its units' point costs. Army list structure. Each army is divided into several army categories, restricting the selection of units in a way that enables players to enjoy a balanced and fair gaming experience. At the same time, they still ensure that armies used in the game can employ a wide variety of styles. This could represent a single character and its hunting party or large armies numbering in their thousands clashing for the fate of the world. All armies in the Ninth Age, Fantasy Battles are subject to the basic composition rules detailed in this section. Army points. Before building an army, you will want to decide with your opponent on the size of the battle, referred to as army points. The combined point costs of every unit in your army, as described in Point Costs, page 19, must not exceed the army points. An army may fall below the limit by up to 40 points. Army categories. An army list is divided into army categories, and every unit on the army list belongs to one or more army categories. These are marked by icons in the unit entries in the army book. The number of points a player can spend on each of these army categories is defined in each army book. The army categories are divided into three groupings: the commanders and the outstanding individuals, characters, the backbone of the force, core and special, and the thematic unique additions, army, specific. All armies must have units from the characters and core army categories in their army list. Characters. This army category always has a maximum amount of points that can be spent on it, usually 40% of the army points. Each army must contain at least one character that is eligible to be the army's general. See the general, page 21. Unless specifically stated otherwise, entries that belong to this army category are characters. See character, page 90. Characters represent the leaders and exceptional individuals who, through their particular sets of skills, influence the course of battle using either brute force, tactical acumen, spell casting ability, or engineering knowledge. It is they who muster the army, and your force will always include at least one representative of this army category to serve as your army general. Core. This army category always has a minimum amount of points that must be spent on it, usually 25% of the army points. The core represents the most readily available warriors a faction has access to and will form the bulk of combatants under the command of the characters in the force. No matter where or why the faction fights, the core are those units that will always be present in some combination as part of the fighting force. They are also those warriors that a society can provide for battle in the greatest numbers. While armies can overwhelmingly be formed out of the core units, it is rarely the case as each commander seeks to deploy a force that contains as many of their finest or more specialized warriors as possible, depending on the resources available to them. Special. This army category has no maximum or minimum limit. You are free to spend any amount of points on units in this army category, so long as the requirements of the army composition are met. The special army category represents more specialized warriors. A faction can call upon large numbers of these warriors, and they can often be the most numerous segment of the entire fighting force. However, their numbers are still limited, and though some of these units can form an entire battle line, there just isn't enough of them to form armies on their own. Army specific. This army category has a maximum amount of points that can be spent on it. The limit is defined within individual army books. All armies have one or more army-specific categories. The army-specific categories are introduced to provide additional limitations in the process of army building. These limitations are designed to be reflective of the nature of the faction in question and with the goal of ensuring greater balance of the game. There are 3 types of army-specific categories. One type is simply an additional grouping of units connected with a certain theme. These are given a thematic name reflective of the army they are part of or the function they perform. For example, orcs and goblins, death from above. The second type of army-specific categories provides limitations linked with a certain function a unit from another army category performs within the army. For example, beast herds, ambush predators. And the third type of army-specific categories is a mix of the above. Units belonging to more than one army category. Some units can be included in more than one army category, which is represented by more than one icon in their entry. In these cases, simply count the unit's point cost towards the limits of all its army categories, but only once towards the army's point cost. Adding army categories. Choosing certain options can make a unit count towards another army category in addition to its original army category. For example, giving a unit shooting weapons might make it also count towards the ranged support army category. This is marked by a small icon of the additional army category, displayed underneath the original army category icons, together with the conditions for counting towards this additional army category. Splitting point cost between army categories. In some rare cases, a unit's point cost can be split between different army categories, where the point cost for some particular option is additionally counted towards a different army category than the unit. This is marked in the unit entry by a split icon, with the 2 halves representing the 2 army categories the unit counts towards. For example, a 250 points elf character counted towards the character's army category decides to ride a 500 points dragon, which is an option marked to count additionally towards beasts and monsters. In this case, the player must count the entire unit's point cost. 250 plus 500 is equal to 750 points towards characters and the dragon's point cost, 500 points, towards beasts and monsters. Duplication limits and restrictions. Certain units and options are limited in number in the army. 0 to X items per army. Some items in the army books are marked with 0 to X items per army. For example, 0 to 2 units per army, 0 to 2 models per army, 0 to 2 mounts per army. Such items can be included from 0 to X times in the same army. The maximum limit, X, is halved for warbands and doubled for grand armies, rounding fractions up. See below. One of a kind. Items, units, upgrades, equipment, etc., marked as one of a kind may only be taken once per army. This is not changed for warbands or grand armies. Minimum army size. Every army must contain a minimum of 4 units. Characters do not count towards this minimum. All units with the War Machine Universal Rule together count as a single unit for this purpose. The General. A single character in the army must be named the General. At least one character must be included in the army that is eligible to fulfill this role. Who is the General must be noted on the army list. The General gains commanding presence. Warbands and Grand Armies. The rules for army composition are modified depending on the size of an army. An army that is unusually small or unusually large is subject to the following rules. Warbands. Armies of 3,000 points or less are called warbands. The minimum army size is decreased to 3 units. All 0 to X items per army limits are halved, rounding fractions up. The usual board size is 36 inches wide and 48 inches deep. Grand Armies. Armies of 8,000 points or more are called Grand Armies. All 0 to X items per army limits are doubled. Adapt the board size to the size of the game. How to read unit entries. Every unit in the game has a certain set of characteristics and possibly optional or mandatory upgrades, and as explained above, every unit is part of an army category. In addition, the models in that unit may be equipped with particular weapons and armor, and they may have one or more model rules, as you will learn in later chapters of this rulebook. See Model Rules, page 80. Every unit is represented by its unit entry in its army book, and these unit entries contain all the information pertaining to that unit, including the data above as well as further information like model type and height, base size, restrictions regarding the number of models or certain equipment, and so on. This section will explain how the most common information in unit entries is presented in the army books of the Ninth Age. Common unit entries. Unit entries usually consist of a header, the unit profile, and options, as illustrated in Figure 11. Header. The header of a unit entry usually contains all the general information on the unit. See Figure 12. Unit name. This is the name of the unit that will be used, for example, when choosing the unit to perform an action like charging, or when targeting the unit with a spell or a shooting attack. Army category. Every unit is part of an army category, like characters, core, or special, which is important, for example, for building an army or for certain model rules. Each army category is represented by an icon that corresponds to the respective army category as shown in each army book section on army organization. Note that some units may belong to more than one army category. See Army Categories, page 19. In this case, the icons of all these army categories will be depicted. Unit size. The unit size tells you the minimum and the maximum size of the unit when building an army. The minimum unit size corresponds to the number of models that the unit must contain at least. And accordingly, the maximum unit size represents the number of models that the unit can consist of at the most. In the example in Figure 12, a unit of 10 men must consist of at least 15 models when building the army, while you can add up to 35 models, attaining the unit's maximum size of 50 models. Unit cost. The unit cost tells you how many points you have to pay for adding the unit to your army and its minimum size, and how many points each additional model will cost. For some units in the game, an additional model will cost the same amount of points as a model that is part of the unit's minimum size, while for others additional models may be more or less expensive than the initial models. In the example in Figure 12, a unit of 10 men consisting of the minimum size of 15 models will cost 120 points, while each additional 10-man model will cost 10 points. So, for instance, a unit of 25 10 men will cost a total of 220 points, 120 points for the first 15 models, and 100 points for the 10 additional models. Scoring. Some units have a certain model rule called scoring, which is relevant for winning secondary objectives during the game. See Scoring, page 87, and Secondary Objectives, page 29. Units with this model rule will be marked with a pennant icon. Unit cap. Certain units can only be selected a limited number of times in an army. In this case, you will find a 0 to X units/army cap in the unit entry. In the example, an army may contain up to 4 units 10 men, regardless of their size, equipment, etc. Model specifications. Every model in the game has a specific height, type, and base size, which are relevant for a wide variety of game mechanics and model rules.